cop arrested. A black woman then opened her briefcase and went pale. "She is state attorney," he called out before he even reached her. Not "excuse me," not "ma'am," just "hey, sharp and flat," the way you call out to someone you have already decided is not worth more than one syllable. And that single word carried across the cold asphalt of the Caldwell County Courthouse parking lot on a Tuesday morning in November, like a stone skipped across still water, breaking something quiet that had been sitting there undisturbed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because the morning had begun, the way all the mornings in Vivian Brooks' life began, which was to say, quietly, deliberately, with a kind of careful intention that people who have never had to fight for the right to take up space in a room might mistake for shyness, but which was in fact something far closer to strategy. The sky over Caldwell County sat low and heavy that morning, the color of old pewter, the kind of November sky that could not quite decide whether it wanted to rain or simply press down on everything beneath it with the full weight of its indifference. Dead leaves skittered across the asphalt of the courthouse parking lot, pushed around by a wind that had run out of warmth sometime in early October and had not found any since. The American flag on the courthouse flagpole needed replacing. You could tell just by looking at it, the frayed edge along the bottom, the colors gone slightly pale from a season of weather that had not been kind to anything left outside. The courthouse itself was a squat brick building that looked older than it had any right to be, with chipped columns and windows that reflected the gray sky back at you like a mirror that had given up trying to be flattering. It was the kind of place that had convinced itself long ago that nothing here ever needed to change. And the building itself seemed to have absorbed that conviction into its very walls. Vivian Brooks pulled her dark sedan into the lot at 8:47 in the morning and cut the engine. She sat for a moment, just a moment, with her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel and her eyes moving across the face of the courthouse through the windshield. She had been here before. Not this specific courthouse, not this specific parking lot, but this particular feeling. Yes, she knew this feeling, the way you know the feeling of a room that has been kept too cold on purpose. It was the kind of quiet that sat over small towns like Caldwell County like a held breath, the kind of quiet that was not peace at all but was instead the accumulated silence of people who had learned over a long time that it was safer not to speak. She was 44 years old. She had been practicing law since she was 22, and had spent more than 2 decades walking into rooms exactly like this one. Rooms that had not been expecting her, rooms that had arranged themselves around the assumption of her absence. And she had learned in those 2 decades that the most powerful thing she could do in the first 30 seconds of entering any such room was absolutely nothing. Just arrive. Just be present. Let the room figure out what to do with that. She opened the car door and stepped out into the cold morning air. She was dressed in a dark blazer over a white blouse, her natural hair framing her face without apology. No lanyard around her neck. No badge clipped to her hip. No announcement of any kind about who she was or what she did or what authority she carried. She looked exactly like what she was, which was a professional woman arriving for a workday. Nothing more and nothing less, and in a world that sometimes wanted her to be more or less than that. She had learned to find a particular kind of power in the plain and simple fact of it. She reached back into the car and lifted her briefcase from the passenger seat. It was old. The leather had worn soft at the corners from years of handling, and the brass clasp had lost most of its shine sometime around the 2nd decade of use. And if you picked it up without knowing its history, you might wonder why anyone still carried something so obviously past its prime when newer, sleeker options existed in abundance. But Vivian had never been tempted to replace it, not once, because the briefcase had a history that no new leather could replicate. Her mother, Dorothy Brooks, had pressed it into her hands outside the testing center on the day Vivian passed the bar exam, holding it out with both palms flat beneath it like an offering. And she had looked at her daughter with an expression that contained 22 years of everything it had cost both of them to get to that moment, and she had said, simply and completely, "Now you carry something in this that they cannot take from you." Vivian had carried it everywhere since. She had parked in one of the reserved spaces near the side entrance of the courthouse, The ones marked for court officers, which she was entitled to use because she was in fact a court officer, though nothing about her appearance that morning announced this to the world. She was here in what her office called a quiet capacity, which was a phrase that meant she was observing rather than acting, watching rather than moving, gathering information before deciding what to do with it. The matter she was here to observe was case number 2024-CR-1189, Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, a civil rights complaint that her office had been tracking for several months, and the file associated with that case number was full of names that deserved considerably better than what they had gotten, and Vivian had come to watch and listen and learn exactly what she was dealing with before she decided what came next. She locked the car. She straightened her blazer with one hand. She did not know that she was already being watched. Across the lot near the far entrance, a Caldwell County Sheriff's Department cruiser sat idling with its engine running. Deputy Rex Calhoun was behind the wheel, and he had been there for the better part of 20 minutes filling out a routine arrest report on a clipboard he held against the steering wheel, not paying particular attention to anything outside the windshield. Rex was 39 years old and built like a man who had grown up being told that size was the same thing as power, and had never been given a compelling reason to question the equation. Broad shoulders, a jaw that jutted forward slightly as though it were always halfway into an argument. It was sure of winning a uniform pressed to a crispness that bordered on aggressive boots so clean they reflected the pale morning sky back up at you from the asphalt. He had the easy, settled look of someone who has never once, not for a single morning in his entire adult life, woken up and wondered whether today might be the day that consequences arrived. His uncle was Sheriff Dale Calhoun. Rex had worked this county for 13 years. In those 13 years, no one had ever asked him to explain himself in a way that required more than a confident shrug and 2 words, and that arrangement had suited him perfectly. Rex had a rule, and the rule had served him without fail for 13 years. Certain people in certain spaces meant something was wrong. Not because of any law he could cite, not because of any training manual he had consulted, but because of something he trusted more than law, and more than training, which was his gut, his instinct, the accumulated weight of 13 years of deciding who belonged and who did not. His gut had never once told him to look the other way, and he had built an entire professional identity on the reliability of that instinct, on the certainty that what he felt in the first 4 seconds of seeing someone was as good as evidence. Just before the cruiser door opened, he had finished the last line of the report he was writing, a report about a traffic stop from the previous afternoon. The man he had stopped had done nothing wrong. Rex had known it within 30 seconds. But the man had been driving a car nicer than the neighborhood he was driving through, and Rex's gut had spoken, and so Rex had written the report, the way he always wrote reports, when his gut was certain, and the facts were thin, suspicious behavior, failure to comply, obstruction. 3 phrases in that order, copy and pasted from a template he had been using for so long he no longer thought about the words themselves. He had set the clipboard on the passenger seat satisfied, and looked up, and that was when he saw Vivian Brooks. His eyes moved across the lot and found her the way that certain eyes always find certain things, not because the thing is doing anything remarkable, but because the eye has been trained by years of unchecked instinct to flag it as remarkable anyway. He watched her step out of her car, watched her lift the briefcase, watched her lock the door with a quiet click and turn toward the courthouse entrance without looking in his direction even once. Something shifted in his face, in the particular way that things shift in the faces of men who have operated without accountability for a very long time. A slight tightening around the eyes, a chin lifting just a degree or two, nothing that could be named precisely, but everything that could be recognized by anyone who had seen it before. It was not anything she had done. She had not made noise, had not caused a scene, had not done a single thing that any of the dozens of other people who moved through this lot every morning had not also done. She had simply parked and stepped out and begun walking toward the courthouse the same as everyone else. But Rex Calhoun was looking at the reserved space she had parked in, and then he was looking at her, and then he was looking at the space again, and in the span of approximately 4 seconds, his gut had delivered its verdict, the way it always delivered its verdict, quickly and completely and without appeal. He set the clipboard down. He opened his door. He stepped out into the cold morning air and started walking, and as he walked he hooked both thumbs into his duty belt in the easy, territorial way he had been doing since his first week on the job. A gesture so habitual he was no longer aware he was doing it, a gesture that said, without words, that he owned the ground he was moving across and everything on it. He called out before he reached her that flat, single syllable cutting across the parking lot, and Vivian stopped walking and turned around slowly, and she held his gaze with the steady patience of a woman who has been interrupted by men like Rex Calhoun more times than she could count, and has long since stopped being surprised by it, though she has never once stopped noticing it. Rex crossed the remaining distance between them with his chin lifted and his thumbs still hooked in his belt, looking her over the way people look over things they have already made up their minds about and are only examining out of a formality they do not particularly believe in. "You cannot park there," he said. Vivian's voice was even and unhurried. "These spaces are reserved for court officers." Rex gave a slow nod, the kind of nod that is designed to make the person receiving it feel as though they have said something slightly below the level of intelligence required to be taken seriously. "Court officers," he said. "Right. Not you." "I am a court officer," Vivian said. A short laugh escaped him. Not a real laugh, not the kind that comes from genuine amusement, but the kind that is deployed as a tool meant to compress someone to make them feel the specific smallness of being laughed at by someone who has decided you are beneath real engagement. His eyes moved over her again. The blazer, the briefcase, the natural hair, the complete absence of any visible credential, and whatever he was looking for in that second pass he apparently still did not find. He told her he was going to need her to move the vehicle right now. Vivian did not move. Something flickered across Rex Calhoun's face, then a brief flash of something that was almost surprise, but settled quickly into irritation, because people in this parking lot moved when Rex Calhoun told them to move. That was simply how this worked. It had always worked this way, and the fact that this woman was standing in front of him with her feet planted and her gaze steady was registering in his nervous system as something closer to a provocation than a misunderstanding. "Did you hear me?" he said, and his voice had dropped lower. "I heard you," Vivian said, and she turned slightly and reached for her briefcase, which was resting against the side of the car. "I have documentation that will clarify the situation," she began, and her fingers had barely moved toward the handle when Rex Calhoun moved faster than his broad-shouldered deliberateness suggested. He was capable of stepping forward and snatching the briefcase off the car in one sharp motion, pulling it away and holding it out to his side and up away from her, the way adults sometimes hold things away from children who are reaching for something they have not been given permission to touch. His eyes meeting hers with an expression that dared her to try to take it back. And here in this moment, Rex Calhoun's left thumb hooked back into his belt after he snatched the briefcase, a small automatic gesture of reclaimed dominance, the body reasserting authority even as the hands were full of someone else's property. A gesture so natural to him that he did not notice he was doing it. But Vivian noticed, and the courthouse clerk who was watching from 20 feet away noticed in this gesture this particular small movement of a thumb finding the familiar groove of a duty belt would become one of the things people remembered later when they tried to describe what kind of man Rex Calhoun was. "Step away from the car," he said. A small crowd had started to form, the way crowds always form around these situations. Quietly, incrementally. One person stopping, and then another, and then a third, until there was a loose half-circle of courthouse employees and morning visitors near the entrance. Nobody saying anything. Everyone watching. Near the edge of this gathering, a young black woman stood with her lanyard still swinging slightly from how quickly she had stopped walking. Her name was Tanya Reed, 23 years old, a courthouse records clerk in her second year on the job, and she recognized immediately, and without any ambiguity, what she was looking at, the way people who have been paying attention their whole lives recognize certain things on sight. Her hand moved into her pocket and came out with her phone, and she raised it and pressed record and said nothing, because she understood that what was needed from her in this moment was not words, but documentation. Rex had stepped in closer to Vivian, now close enough that she would have had to move him out of the way to reach her own car door, and the briefcase was still held away from her at his side, and he was using his physical size the way he had always used it, as a statement, as a form of punctuation at the end of a sentence that the other person was not invited to respond to. He told her she had a real problem with following simple instructions, and he told her that what he saw right now was a woman who had parked where she did not belong and was now giving him grief about it. And he said all of this in a tone that suggested he had said versions of it so many times that the words had gone smooth from use like stones in a river worn down to their essential shape. "I would like to show you my credentials," Vivian said. "They are in that briefcase. And I would like you to put your hands behind your back," Rex said. She did not fight him. That was the thing that the people watching would remember later above everything else. She did not argue any further. She did not pull away. She stood straight and she let him take her wrists, and she kept her eyes forward, level and calm, while he snapped the cuffs on, and the only sounds in the world in that moment were the metal clicking shut around her wrists and the wind moving across the cold asphalt of the parking lot, and the very faint sound of Tanya Reed's phone continuing to record everything. Rex turned her toward the cruiser. Her briefcase swung from his other hand, and before he opened the door, Vivian spoke one more time, her voice quiet and almost gentle, the voice of someone who knows exactly how a room is going to end and is simply marking the moment before it does. "You are going to want to open that briefcase," she said, "before you put me in that car." Rex laughed out loud. Then a real laugh, this time wide and genuine and easy. The laugh of a man who has heard something he considers delightfully absurd. "Lady," he said, pulling the cruiser door open, "I do not need to open anything." He put her in the back seat. He tossed her briefcase onto the front passenger seat without so much as a glance at it. He got behind the wheel. He drove. Tanya Reed did not lower her phone until the cruiser had disappeared completely from sight. The courthouse annex processing area smelled like old coffee and fluorescent lights, which is to say, it smelled like every processing room in every courthouse in every mid-sized American county, a smell that had absorbed decades of anxiety and paperwork, and the particular defeat of people being reduced in the space of a few keystrokes from human beings to case numbers. It was a small room, a front desk with a computer that looked a decade past its functional lifespan, a row of plastic chairs bolted to the wall, at intervals that suggested they had been designed with discomfort in mind, a bulletin board covered in papers that no one had updated in months, the kind of room that existed purely as a mechanism, a way of moving people from one category to another with the minimum possible amount of human engagement. Vivian sat in one of the plastic chairs with her hands cuffed behind her back and her spine perfectly straight, not slumped, not fidgeting, watching the room with the same quality of attention she had brought to hundreds of courtrooms across 22 years of practice, quiet and complete, and missing nothing. She had long ago learned that rooms like this one revealed everything about the people who ran them, and she was learning a great deal. Rex dropped her briefcase on the front desk with a careless thud that she felt in her chest, not from the sound but from what the sound meant, and he settled in at the computer keyboard with the relaxed proprietary ease of a man composing a document. He has composed many times before, a man for whom this moment is simply administrative, a formality before the machinery moves on to the next thing. Deputy Warren Hicks appeared from a back hallway, older somewhere around 55, with a soft face and the slightly rounded shoulders of someone who has spent a career trying to take up as little space as possible in rooms occupied by people with stronger opinions than his. He took in the scene in a single glance: Vivian in the chair, Rex at the keyboard, the briefcase on the desk, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a question, but was shaped like one, and he did not ask it out loud. Rex told him to run inventory on the briefcase and whatever was in her pockets. Hicks nodded. He moved to the desk. He set down a clipboard and an inventory form and reached for the briefcase with the routine efficiency of someone who has done this task hundreds of times and expects nothing from it, and the clasp opened with a soft click that was the most ordinary sound in the world, and he lifted the lid. He stood there for a moment, completely still. His eyes moved slowly across the contents of the briefcase, taking in what was there with the careful deliberateness of a man who is making absolutely certain he is seeing what he thinks he is seeing. Because what he thinks he is seeing does not match any version of this morning that he had prepared himself for when he came into work. His hand, which had been reaching toward the inventory clipboard, stopped in midair. Just stopped, and then withdrew without completing the motion, and he set the clipboard back down without filling anything in, and the fluorescent light overhead, which had been humming at its usual frequency the entire time, suddenly seemed very loud in the stillness of the room. Inside the briefcase, sitting in plain view on top of a manila folder, was a leather credential wallet, black official, the kind of thing that has a specific weight and texture that makes it immediately distinguishable from anything else you might carry in a bag. He picked it up and opened it. Behind a clear plastic window was a gold badge, and below the badge, printed on cardstock with the state seal embossed in the upper left corner in the particular deep blue that belonged to no other institution in this state, were the words, State Attorney, 7th Judicial Circuit. He turned the credential wallet over carefully, the way you handle something that has changed the nature of the room you are standing in. Behind the badge window was a second card, an official appointment letter, and the signature at the bottom of that letter belonged to the governor of the state. Behind the appointment letter was a Department of Justice observer credential with Vivian Brooks' photograph on it, a photograph in which she looked exactly the way she looked right now, sitting in a plastic chair with her hands behind her back, composed and watchful and completely unsurprised by how things had gone. And underneath all of these things, at the very bottom of the briefcase, was a manila folder, its tab labeled in clean black type, Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, Civil Rights Complaint File, Case Number 2024-CR-1189. Warren Hicks went pale. He stood completely still for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when the room is as quiet as this room was. And then he straightened slowly, and he turned toward Rex Calhoun at the keyboard, and he held up the badge. Just held it up in the air between them without speaking, without moving, without doing anything at all except making it visible, because there was nothing he could have said that would have communicated what needed to be communicated as efficiently as simply holding up that gold badge and letting Rex Calhoun see it. The keyboard went silent. Rex looked up from the screen. He looked at the badge. Then his eyes moved to the credential wallet in Hicks's other hand. Then to the briefcase still open on the desk with the governor's letter visible inside it, sitting there in plain view, as though it had been waiting patiently all morning for exactly this moment. Then his eyes moved to Vivian. The color left his face the way water leaves a bathtub slow, and then, all at once, and the flush that had been sitting on his ears since the parking lot faded and was replaced by something closer to gray, and his jaw tightened until the muscle along the side of his face was visible, and a single bead of sweat appeared at his hairline in a room that was not warm, and in the space between 1 second and the next, Rex Calhoun's memory served him the parking lot in complete and merciless detail. The way he had grabbed the briefcase off the car, the way he had laughed, the way her voice had been quiet and almost gentle when she had said, "You are going to want to open that briefcase before you put me in that car," and the way he had said, "Lady, I do not need to open anything," and then opened the car door instead. And the memory of his own laugh echoing back at him now sounded like something entirely different from what it had sounded like 40 minutes ago when it was coming out of his mouth. The room was absolutely quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. The silence had weight and direction. Vivian let it sit exactly as long as she wanted it to. Then she looked at Rex Calhoun, and her expression was not anger, and it was not triumph. It was something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The steady level gaze of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment since the instant a man's hand closed around the handle of her briefcase and pulled it away from her in a cold parking lot. "I have been patient," she said. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Now uncuff me." Rex did not move immediately. He stood behind the desk with his jaw tight and the calculations happening visibly behind his eyes, looking for some version of this situation that did not end the way it was clearly ending. Some angle or argument or procedural technicality that might change the shape of what was happening, and finding nothing, because there was nothing to find, because the briefcase was open on the desk, and the badge was in Warren Hicks's hand, and the governor's letter was sitting in plain view. And there was no version of any of this that led anywhere except exactly where it was already going. He came around the desk. He uncuffed her without a word, without looking at her face, working by feel at her wrists with his eyes pointed at the middle distance. Vivian stood. She rolled her wrists once slowly, and then she straightened her blazer with both hands in a gesture that was entirely unhurried, entirely deliberate, and entirely devastating in its calm. She crossed to the desk and retrieved her credential wallet, her appointment letter, her DOJ credential, and her civil rights complaint file, placing each item back into the briefcase with the careful attention of someone returning things to their proper order after they have been disturbed, the way you handle things that matter. She closed the clasp. She looked at Warren Hicks, and her voice when she spoke to him was warm and entirely genuine. "Thank you, Deputy Hicks," she said. "I appreciate your professionalism." Hicks gave a small, stiff nod, the nod of a man who desperately wanted to be somewhere else in the world and was making the best of his current location. Vivian picked up her briefcase. She did not look at Rex Calhoun again, not once, not even a glance, as though he had already receded to a level of relevance that did not require her attention. She walked out. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside, sharp and clean after the stale warmth of the processing room, and she stopped on the bottom step and pulled in a slow breath and let the morning settle around her. She had known walking into that room how it would end. She had known the moment Warren Hicks reached for that clasp. But knowing something with your mind and living through it with your body are two entirely different experiences, and her hands, which had been perfectly steady through every second of it, had now developed the faintest tremor, a small and private acknowledgement of what the last hour had actually cost her, which she squeezed away by tightening her grip on the briefcase handle. She was fine. She had always been fine. She started walking. "Miss Brooks." The voice came from her left. The woman moving toward her from the edge of the parking lot had the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting and did not intend to waste another second of it. A woman in her late 50s with a full figure and a dark wool coat and a city councilwoman's pin on the lapel and a face that was carrying something between anger and fear, something in the territory between those two emotions that did not yet have a name, but was moving toward one. "Councilwoman Barbara Price," Vivian said. Barbara stopped in front of her and looked her over, taking in the blazer and the briefcase and the wrists where the cuffs had been, and exhaled through her nose in the specific way of someone who had hoped they were wrong about something and have just confirmed they were right. "Tanya called me from inside the building," she said. "She got the whole thing on her phone. It is already going around on social media." Vivian nodded slowly. "How much?" she said. "Enough." Barbara's jaw tightened. "People saw it, Vivian. A deputy handcuffing a black woman in a courthouse parking lot in broad daylight. It is moving fast." Vivian looked out across the lot for a moment and thought about Rex Calhoun back inside, sitting at that keyboard, the red still fading from his ears, the briefcase sitting on the desk between them like an answer to a question he had been too arrogant to ask. She thought about how easy he had looked doing it, how comfortable, how entirely unsurprised by himself. Barbara said she should report it through channels, file the formal complaint, let it move through the process. She could be home by tonight and nobody could blame her for stepping back from this one. Barbara paused. "That is what I would tell you to do," she said. "If I thought for one single second that is what you should do." Vivian looked at her. Barbara reached into the inside pocket of her wool coat and produced a thin file folder, maybe a dozen pages, which she held the way people hold things that carry more weight than their physical dimensions suggest. She held it out. Vivian took it. The name on the top page was Monique Adams, 19 years old. The incident report was dated 9 months ago, a Tuesday in February, a parking lot outside the county social services office. Same deputy, same language in the report, suspicious behavior, failure to comply, obstruction. Vivian read it standing right there on the courthouse steps in the cold November morning, and Barbara Price waited because Barbara had read it already and knew what it required. Monique Adams had been working part-time at a supermarket on the east side of the county. She had a 14-month-old daughter and a mother who watched the baby on the days Monique worked. She had no prior record, no attorney, and no money to retain one. A public defender, overwhelmed and apologetic, had advised her in a 10-minute hallway conversation outside the courtroom that her chances at trial were not good and that the plea deal being offered would resolve the matter quickly and allow her to move forward with her life. Monique had taken the deal because what else do you do when the only lawyer available to you is standing in a hallway telling you the odds? The misdemeanor conviction for obstruction of justice had cost her a housing assistance voucher she had waited 16 months to receive. It had cost her the job. It had cost her the kind of clean record that opens doors rather than closing them. The kind of record that allows a 19-year-old woman with a baby daughter and a mother who watches the baby and a part-time job and an apartment she is trying to hold on to imagine that the future contains more than it currently does. Vivian turned the page. There was another name, then another. Barbara had 12 of them paper-clipped together in a neat stack spanning 3 years of incidents. Mostly black women, the files told her. Mostly young. Mostly low income, the kind of low income that means no legal cushion, no safety net, nowhere to fall back to when something goes wrong. The details shifted slightly from case to case, different locations and different dates and different specifics. But the shape of every single one was identical. The same deputy, the same pretextual language in every report, the same escalation pattern, the same consistent pressure that funneled each woman toward a plea deal she could not afford to fight. 12 people, 12 lives, each with a piece taken out of it that had not been taken back. People who had no briefcase to open, no badge inside, no appointment letter with a governor's signature sitting at the bottom. Nothing but their own word against a man with a uniform and a sheriff's department behind him and an uncle who ran the whole operation. Vivian stood very still in the cold morning and read every single page, and when she finished, she closed the folder and held it at her side, and the wind moved across the parking lot and rattled the dead leaves against the base of the flagpole. She looked at Barbara Price. "Get me a conference room," she said. The conference room was small and smelled like old carpet, and the particular staleness of a room where meetings happen that people do not want to be in. A rectangular table, 6 chairs that had not been pushed in properly by the last people to use them, a whiteboard on the far wall with a phone number written in black marker that had never been erased because everyone who might have erased it had assumed someone else would. One window looking out at the courthouse parking lot, the same lot where 3 hours ago Vivian Brooks had been pressed against her own car in handcuffs. She did not look at the window. Barbara had arranged the room through a contact inside the courthouse, a sympathetic clerk, who handed over a key without asking for an explanation, and Vivian had set her briefcase on the table and opened it and spread all 12 complaint files across the surface in a single row, and then she had sat down and pulled her legal pad in front of her and uncapped her pen and started at the beginning because that was where you always started. She read slowly. Some lawyers skim for the headline and move on extracting the essential fact and treating everything around it as context rather than evidence. Vivian had never worked that way, because in her experience every word in a document like this was evidence, including, and especially the words that seemed unimportant, the words that seemed like filler, the words that someone had chosen carefully precisely because they appeared casual. The first file was Monique Adams, and she read it again now, slower this time, taking notes with the methodical attention she brought to every document that was eventually going to end up in front of a judge. Date, location, Rex's specific language in the report. Suspicious behavior. failure to comply, obstruction. She underlined each phrase. She circled them individually. The second file. Kelly Warren, 24 years old, arrested 15 months ago in the parking garage attached to the courthouse, a different level and a different row from the spaces Vivian had parked in that morning. Rex's report contained 3 phrases: suspicious behavior, failure to comply, obstruction. Word for word. Not similar language, not the same general idea expressed differently, but the identical 3 phrases in the identical order, as though he had opened a previous document and copied the relevant section, without troubling himself to change so much as a comma. Kelly Warren had been on her way to the courthouse that morning to file for a restraining order against an ex-boyfriend who had broken her jaw 4 months earlier. The charge against her was later dropped, but not before she had missed 2 consecutive shifts at her job and been let go for unreliability. Vivian drew a line on her legal pad connecting the report language from File 1 to the report language from File 2, a single physical line that was the beginning of the most important document she would produce in 7 weeks. The third file. Sandra Pruitt, 43 years old, mother of 3, who had come to the courthouse to attend her son's hearing on a minor traffic matter. Rex had approached her in the main lot and informed her that she was parked in a fire lane, which she was not, and had escalated when she questioned this assertion, because Sandra Pruitt had the temerity to say, "Officer, I am not parked in a fire lane. Please look at where my car is," and Rex Calhoun had treated this factual statement as an act of aggression. The charge had been reduced to a warning, but the arrest itself had been entered into her record, and her employer, a medical billing company that ran routine checks on their staff every 2 years, had seen it during a scheduled review and placed Sandra on probationary status, where she had been walking a tightrope ever since one wrong step away from losing the job she had held for 9 years. One by one, Vivian worked through all 12 files, and the light through the window she was not looking at shifted from the flat gray of morning to the pale gold of a November afternoon, and she did not notice this because she had not eaten and was not hungry and had not thought about either of those things since she sat down. By the time she reached the last file, her legal pad had 3 full pages of notes, arrows connecting names to dates to locations, circled phrases appearing again and again across 3 years of documents, a column on the right side of the 3rd page with a single header that she had written and underlined twice, pattern. Because that was what. This was not a series of bad days or momentary lapses in judgment or individual incidents that happened to resemble each other by coincidence. This was a machine, a deliberate and repeating structure. Find a black woman alone in a public space, manufacture a reason to engage with her, escalate until she either complied completely or provided a justification, however thin, for an arrest, then funnel her toward a plea deal that she could not afford to fight, and that would follow her for the remainder of her life. Over and over, for 3 years in a county where the deputy's uncle ran the department, and nobody had reviewed his arrest reports carefully enough to notice what was sitting right there in the language identical and incriminating and patient. 12 names, 12 lives with pieces taken out of them. And those were only the ones who had filed complaints, which meant that the actual number was larger, possibly much larger, because the nature of this kind of machine was that it relied on most people deciding that filing a complaint was more costly than absorbing the damage and moving on. Vivian set her pen down and looked at the row of files spread across the table. She thought about her mother, about the briefcase, about the worn leather and the dulled brass clasp, about the morning her mother had pressed it into her hands and said, "Now you carry something in this they cannot take from you." She thought about everything she had spent 22 years building to put inside that briefcase, the credentials and the appointments, and the kind of documented authority that had made Rex Calhoun's ears go red this morning when it was finally revealed to him. And she thought about Monique Adams, 19 years old, standing in a parking lot outside a social services office on a Tuesday morning in February, with a 14-month-old daughter at home and no briefcase and no badge, and nothing inside, anything she was carrying that would make a man like Rex Calhoun go pale. She picked up her phone and called Jerome Whitfield. He answered on the second ring. "I need you in Caldwell County first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring a blank subpoena list." A short pause. Then how many names? Vivian looked at the 12 files spread across the table in front of her. Start with 12, she said, and bring extra paper. She hung up. She pulled the nearest file back toward her. She began writing notes in the margins. Jerome Whitfield arrived at 7:54 in the morning with 2 coffees and a legal pad that already had handwriting on it because Jerome was the kind of person who started preparing the night before and arrived having already begun. He was 31 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with the kind of quiet intensity that caused people meeting him for the first time to underestimate him consistently and reliably right up until the moment they could not anymore, which was usually the moment he placed something on a table in front of them that they had not expected him to have. He had worked with Vivian for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had watched him walk into rooms full of people twice his age and twice his institutional rank, and hold his ground without flinching. And she trusted him the way you trust someone who has never once given you a concrete reason not to. He set one of the coffees in front of her without being asked the way he always did, and dropped into the chair across the table and looked at the 12 files still spread in their row from the night before, and nodded slowly with the focused attention of someone already 3 steps into processing what he was looking at. "Where do we start?" he said. Vivian slid her legal pad across to him. The 3 pages of notes with their arrows and circles, and the column on the right that said pattern in underlined capital letters. Jerome read without speaking, his jaw tightening once approximately halfway down the first page and not loosening again. They spent the morning building the subpoena list, Vivian calling out the documents she needed, and Jerome writing them in his clean, precise handwriting and cross-referencing case numbers against the complaint files. Rex's full arrest record going back 4 years, every court transcript connected to the 12 cases, disposition reports and plea agreement paperwork, any internal review or supervisor sign-off that had touched Rex's reports during those 3 years. By noon, they had a list covering 2 full pages. By 1 o'clock, the subpoenas were drafted. Then Jerome started making calls. The first call lasted 4 minutes. A woman named Gracie Foster, case number 6 on Vivian's list, arrested 11 months ago for allegedly blocking a handicapped parking space, a charge that had been dismissed after she spent a night in county holding and missed a week of work, and came back to find her position had been filled. Gracie listened to Jerome explain who he worked for and what he was calling about, and then she said, very quietly, in the voice of someone who has been through something and come out the other side, only to find that coming out the other side costs you too, that she appreciated the call, but she could not get involved. She had a good job now. The first good job she had managed to land since everything happened. She could not risk it. Jerome thanked her and wrote her response in the margin next to her name and moved to the next one. The second call lasted 90 seconds. A woman who said, "Do not call here again," and hung up. The third did not answer. The fourth went straight to voicemail. The fifth answered, listened for 30 seconds, and said she had tried to fight it once already, and it had cost her more than the original charge ever had, and she was not going through that again, and she was sorry, and she meant both of those things. Jerome kept his voice level through every call, patient and professional, not pushing, not pleading, writing each response in the margin beside the name and moving on. Vivian sat across the table and listened to every conversation without interrupting, without trying to take the phone, watching Jerome's pen move across the page and letting the weight of each response land where it needed to land. By mid-afternoon, he had worked through 10 of the 12 names. 2 brief conversations with women willing to talk but not yet willing to testify. 8 who would not engage at all. The fear in their voices was not loud. It was not crying, not anger, not the kind of fear that announces itself. It was quieter than that, the flat, worn-down quality of people who had already learned at real cost to themselves what happened when they spoke up in Caldwell County. It was the voice of people who had weighed their options and made a calculation, and the calculation had come out the same way every time. The 11th name was Monique Adams. Jerome dialed. The line rang 5 times and went to voicemail. He left a calm, brief message, his name, who he worked for, the number to call back. She did not call back. He tried again an hour later. Voicemail again, shorter message this time. By early evening, Monique Adams still had not responded. Jerome leaned back in his chair and looked at Vivian across the table. "She is the strongest case we have," he said. "I know. Without her as lead plaintiff, the others are harder to build around." "I know that too." She tapped her pen against the legal pad twice. "Keep trying. Tonight and first thing tomorrow morning. If she still will not pick up," she stopped, made a decision, "then I will go myself." Jerome nodded. He gathered his notes and reached for his coat. Outside, the last of the November daylight was fading over Caldwell County, turning the courthouse windows the color of amber and then gray. He left for the motel. Vivian stayed. She pulled the first batch of subpoenaed documents toward her, clicked her pen open, and began reading under the single yellow light of the conference room desk lamp. Thursday morning came in cold and colorless, and Vivian was already at the conference table when the light outside shifted from black to gray, which was to say she had been there for some time before the light changed, working through the documents that had arrived in the overnight subpoena returns, with a focus that had the particular quality of focus that comes not from energy but from necessity, the kind that emerges when you have decided what you are doing, and the only remaining question is how well you can do it. She was deep inside the second document when her personal cell phone buzzed against the table surface. She glanced at the screen. Sheriff Dale, Calhoun, Caldwell County. She looked at it for one full ring, which was long enough to confirm that she was going to pick up and short enough to not appear to have been waiting for it. She picked up. Dale. Calhoun's voice was warm, and that was the first thing she noticed. Not defensive, not clipped, not the voice of a man in damage control mode, but warm in the specific way of a man who has been doing politics in a small county for 40 years and has learned that warmth is the most efficient delivery mechanism for a message that is not actually warm at all. He had a deep, unhurried drawl and the easy confidence of someone who had never once needed to be in a hurry because the world had always arranged itself to wait for him. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I am so glad I caught you. I hope I am not interrupting your morning." "Not at all," she said. "Good, good." A small pause, perfectly timed. I wanted to reach out personally. "What happened in that parking lot on Tuesday? I want you to know that is not a reflection of how this department operates. Rex is a good officer. He made a judgment call under pressure and it went sideways, and I think we can both agree that these things happen from time to time." Vivian said nothing. She let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable. Dale filled it smoothly. He understood there might be some media attention around this, and he completely respected her position, and if there was a formal process she needed to follow, he supported that. Fully, he just wanted to make sure they were communicating directly person to person before this got bigger than it needed to be. "I appreciate that," Vivian said. "I thought you would." His voice warmed another small degree the way a gas flame turns up when you adjust the knob. "Here is my concern, and I am being honest with you because I think you are a smart woman who understands how these things work. You came to Caldwell County to observe a civil rights matter, an important one, and I would genuinely hate to see the legitimacy of that case clouded by what could look like a personal grievance on your part." He let that land. "People will say you had an agenda coming in. You know how they talk." "I understand your concern," Vivian said. "I knew you would." Another pause. And when he spoke again, the warmth had a new texture to it, something harder underneath, like a handshake where the other person's grip is a little too tight. "Rex has been with this department for 13 years, he said. "Good record. Good family. I would hate to see a misunderstanding turn into something that damages a career and muddies waters that did not need muddying, especially when the person stirring those waters is. And I mean this with complete respect, still fairly early in a very promising career." There it was, wrapped in a compliment so that it would sting less going in. fairly early in a very promising career. She was 44 years old. She had been practicing law since she was 22. She had made state attorney before most of Dale Calhoun's deputies had finished their probationary periods. She had argued in front of 3 different federal circuit courts. She had been in this work for longer than Rex Calhoun had been wearing a badge. But to Dale Calhoun, speaking from behind 13 years of his nephew's unchecked behavior in a county where the name Calhoun had been sufficient authorization for almost anything, she was a young woman who did not yet fully understand how Caldwell County worked. And the implication was that if she were as smart as he was saying she was, she would let someone who understood help her understand. Vivian looked at the subpoenaed documents spread in front of her on the conference table. 3 years of arrest reports with identical language. 12 women with pieces of their lives taken away and never returned. "I hear you clearly, Sheriff," she said. "Thank you for taking the time to call." Of course. The relief in his voice was almost imperceptible, but Vivian heard it, the fractional easing of a man who believed he had just landed something. He thought she was going to step back. He thought the call had worked. "Have a good day," he said. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the table and sat for a moment looking at the wall across from her, thinking about the texture of Dale Calhoun's voice. The warmth that was not warmth. The respect that was not respect. The way he had called her smart. In the same breath he had used to suggest she was too inexperienced to understand what she was looking at. The way men like Dale Calhoun had been doing that to her since she was 22 years old, smiling while they tried to make you smaller, complimenting you on your potential, while explaining why that potential did not quite reach to the level required for this particular situation. She had been getting that her whole career. She was probably going to keep getting it for the rest of it. She picked up her pen. When Jerome appeared in the doorway a minute later with his coat still on and his legal pad under his arm ready for the day, Vivian looked up at him with an expression he recognized immediately, the particular focused clarity that meant she had just been handed something and had decided what to do with it. "Expand the subpoena list," she said. Jerome uncapped his pen without missing a beat and pulled out the chair across from her, and Vivian was already back inside the documents before he had settled into his seat. Friday morning, and Jerome came in with the particular expression of someone delivering news that is both good and complicated in equal measure, the expression of someone who has not slept much and does not mind. "Monique Adams called back," he said. Finally, Vivian said. "And?" He looked down at his notepad. Read it back exactly as it had been said to him. She said, and I am quoting directly, "I do not care how fancy your boss is. Fancy does not protect people like me." He set the pad down. Then she hung up. Vivian stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked at the window at the courthouse lot outside, gray and cold and flat under a November sky that had not changed its mind about anything since Tuesday. "Give me her address," she said. Jerome looked up. "You want me to come?" he began. "No," she said, holding out her hand. "Just the address." Monique Adams lived in a 2-story apartment complex on the eastern edge of Caldwell County. The kind of building that had been built with the intention of being functional and had been declining ever since without anyone in a position to do something about it, deciding that they should. The exterior paint had gone from white to the color of old dishwater. The parking lot had potholes that had been addressed with gravel rather than asphalt, the cheaper answer that acknowledges the problem without solving it. A rusted metal mailbox station near the entrance had 3 doors hanging open and 1 missing entirely, and the remaining doors moved in the cold wind that came through the lot from the east. Vivian parked, straightened her blazer with both hands, and walked up the exterior staircase to the 2nd floor. She knocked on apartment 208. Nothing for a moment. Then the sound of movement inside something soft and small skittering across a hard floor. Adult footsteps, the particular quality of silence that means someone is standing on the other side of a door and deciding whether to open it, the silence of deliberation rather than absence. The door opened 4 inches. The security chain caught it there. One eye looked out at Vivian, young and tired and wary, in the specific way of someone who has learned from direct experience that unexpected knocks on the door of your apartment rarely bring anything you were hoping for. "Monique Adams," Vivian said. "Who are you?" the voice behind the door said. Vivian kept her voice quiet. No authority in it, no official edge, just honesty set out plainly. "My name is Vivian Brooks. I am the state attorney for the 7th Judicial Circuit. I am not here to serve you anything, and I am not here to make demands. I would just like to talk to you if you are willing. That is all." A long pause. The door closed. The chain slid free with a small metallic sound. The door opened all the way. Monique Adams was 19 years old and carried the particular weight of someone who has been asked to manage more than her age has prepared her for and has been managing it anyway, without complaint because there was no one else available to manage it. She was slight, dressed in a gray sweatshirt and jeans, with her hair pulled back in a way that was practical rather than decorative, and she had dark circles under her eyes that did not come from one bad night, but from months of them accumulating, the way debt accumulates without announcement, until the balance is something you carry with you everywhere you go. Behind her, a little girl approximately 18 months old in yellow socks was pushing a plastic toy across the linoleum floor of the kitchen, with complete and cheerful indifference to anything happening at the front door. Monique did not invite Vivian inside. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, tired and proud in equal measure, refusing on principle to let the tired win. "My investigator said you want me to testify," Monique said. "I want to talk to you first." "About what?" "About how I should trust the system. About how this time it will be different." She shook her head. The motion, small and controlled the shake of someone who has rehearsed patience with this particular category of conversation. "Lady, I took that deal because a lawyer I could not afford told me I had no chance. I lost my voucher. I lost my job. I have got a record now that follows me around everywhere I go like a shadow I cannot step out of." She looked at Vivian directly, steadily, with the direct gaze of someone who has stopped apologizing for seeing things clearly. What exactly is there left to talk about? Vivian did not argue. She did not reach for reassurance or try to paint the situation in better colors than the ones it actually came in. She spoke plainly the way she had learned to speak in rooms where plain speaking was the only currency that had any real value. "Your case is the strongest of 12, she said. 12 women that Rex Calhoun arrested the same way he arrested you, with the same language in every report. The same pressure toward plea deals, the same pattern repeated over 3 years in a department where nobody was looking closely enough to stop it." Monique was listening. She was pretending to be doing something other than listening, but she was listening. "Without you," Vivian continued, "those 12 cases are 12 separate complaints, hard to connect, easy to dismiss individually, easy for someone with legal resources to pick apart one at a time. With you as the lead, your documentation and your timeline and your collateral losses become the spine everything else attaches to. 12 names become a pattern becomes a case becomes a verdict, and a verdict becomes a permanent record that follows Rex Calhoun for the rest of his professional life, the same way that misdemeanor conviction follows you." The little girl in yellow socks toddled to the doorway of the kitchen and looked up at her mother with the complete, uncomplicated trust of someone who is still at the age where her mother represents the entire known universe. Monique looked down at her daughter. She stayed there for a long moment looking at that small face, and something moved across her own face that was not resolve exactly. Not yet, but something quieter and more personal than resolve. Something that had been waiting in the back of her chest for a long time for something concrete enough to attach itself to. She looked back at Vivian. "Okay," she said. Vivian reached into her briefcase and set it on the table just inside the doorway. She opened the clasp and took out a blank legal pad and a pen and held them out to Monique. "Tell me everything she said. from the beginning, in your own words. Monique took the legal pad. She held the pen for a moment, the way you hold something when you are deciding whether you are really going to do the thing you have been considering, and then she began. The next 3 weeks moved with the particular quality of motion that serious legal work always has, which is to say it was quiet and relentless and unglamorous and entirely without fanfare, the kind of motion that does not photograph well but that produces the only kind of result that actually holds. Vivian and Jerome built the case the way you build anything that is going to have to support real weight. One document at a time. One verified fact set carefully on top of the last tested before adding the next one. Nothing included that could not withstand examination. Nothing skipped because it was inconvenient to obtain. The subpoenaed records came back in batches over the first week, each batch adding another layer of clarity to the pattern that Vivian had first seen written in the margins of her legal pad. Rex's identical report language, across case after case, his escalation tactics, the consistent targeting of black women in public spaces, the pipeline from arrest to plea deal that had operated with quiet efficiency for 3 years without triggering a single internal flag or generating a single supervisory note of concern in Rex Calhoun's personnel file. 4 of the 12 complainants eventually agreed to participate after multiple patient conversations with Jerome, not to testify, not yet, but to provide formal statements and allow their case files to be incorporated into the larger filing. It was not everything, but it was enough to move. Monique Adams signed her formal complaint agreement on a Wednesday afternoon at the kitchen table of apartment 208 with her daughter asleep in the next room. She signed it without ceremony and without drama, just picked up the pen and signed it and slid it back across the table, and the smallness of the gesture and the size of what it meant lived in the same space simultaneously. On a gray Monday morning, 3 weeks after the parking lot, Vivian's office filed formal charges against Deputy Rex Calhoun. Civil rights violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 Misconduct in Office Abuse of Authority. All 12 complainants named. Monique Adams listed as lead plaintiff. The filing was 51 pages long, and every single page had been built to withstand whatever came at it, because Vivian knew that whatever came at it would be significant. By noon that Monday, Councilwoman Barbara Price was standing on the courthouse steps in front of cameras reading from a prepared statement, in a voice that was clear and steady and carried all the way across the plaza and behind her. A small crowd had gathered, courthouse employees and local residents, and a handful of people whose names appeared somewhere in those 51 pages, and none of them said anything while Barbara was speaking because what she was saying did not require accompaniment. 3 national civil rights organizations issued statements of support before the afternoon was out. 2 of them sent representatives to Caldwell County by the following morning. By the end of that day, Rex Calhoun had been placed on administrative leave with pay. His union filed a grievance within hours. For 48 hours, the air in Caldwell County felt genuinely different, lighter the way air feels after something has been said that has been waiting a long time to be said. Vivian let herself feel that for exactly 1 evening. She ordered food to the conference room and ate it while reviewing the next round of documents, and allowed herself one single moment of something close to relief. Then the floor fell out. It happened fast, the way it always happens when someone with sufficient resources decides they are not going to let something proceed without a fight. The first blow came on a Wednesday morning. A retired judge named Harold Fenwick, a man Vivian had never personally met, filed a sworn legal affidavit with the court, claiming that at a Bar Association dinner 6 months earlier, Vivian Brooks had expressed unmistakable personal animosity toward the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, and that this animosity rendered her professionally compromised and emotionally invested in a way that made her unfit to pursue the matter objectively. Before Vivian had finished reading the affidavit, the Sheriff's Department's legal team filed an emergency motion requesting that she be recused from the case entirely on grounds of personal bias, citing her own arrest as evidence of a conflict of interest, arguing that a prosecutor who had been personally targeted by the defendant could not be trusted to pursue justice without allowing personal grievance to color her judgment. The arrest they had committed against her. Repurposed now as a weapon to protect the man who had committed it, the second blow landed the same afternoon. Someone and Vivian had a reasonable idea of who had located and leaked Monique Adams's sealed juvenile record to a conservative local blog. A shoplifting charge from when Monique was 16 years old 3 years ago, a bottle of nail polish in a discount store. The blog published it under a headline that described Monique as a career criminal and characterized her as a manufactured victim, carefully selected by Vivian for maximum media sympathy rather than genuine legal merit. By evening, the post had been shared several hundred times across social media platforms, and by 9 o'clock that night, Monique was calling Jerome with a voice that was tight and fractured and right at the edge of something breaking, saying she wanted to withdraw. Midnight. The conference room silent except for the fluorescent light overhead. Vivian sat alone at the table with the recusal motion in front of her face up, and beside it the complaint document with Monique Adams's name printed at the top as lead plaintiff. She understood the geometry of what was happening with complete clarity. If she was removed, the case would pass to a junior prosecutor, someone without her specific knowledge of these files, someone who would be starting nearly from scratch, and the legal machinery of delay and motion and counter-motion would bury the thing before it ever got to trial. 12 names would go back to meaning nothing. The machine would keep running. She stared at the motion and did not move for a long time. Then she began working through it, line by line, building her counter-arguments in the margin, the way she had always built arguments methodically without rushing one solid brick at a time. The motion was well constructed, she gave them, that whoever had drafted it knew what they were doing. They had taken the most damaging fact available, that Rex Calhoun had personally arrested her, and reframed it not as evidence of Rex Calhoun's misconduct, but as evidence of Vivian's bias. It was dirty. It was also genuinely smart. She was still working through the 4th page when her phone lit up. Jerome, 3:08 in the morning. She picked up. His voice had the particular energy of someone who has not slept and does not care because he has found something. Fenwick, he said. Harold Fenwick. I have been digging since midnight. Vivian sat up straighter. His son-in-law, Jerome, said. A man named Marcus Briley. I pulled the department roster. Briley is an active lieutenant in the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department. Has been for 7 years. Vivian wrote the name down. That is not all. She could hear him turning pages on his end of the line. Dale Calhoun does an annual fundraiser every spring, and the public financial disclosures go back 5 years. Fenwick's name appears in the donor records for 4 consecutive years. Not large amounts, but he is there documented on the public record. Keep going, Vivian said. I cross-referenced the presiding judges on the original hearings for all 12 complainants, Jerome said, and he paused in the way he paused when he was about to hand her the piece that mattered most. Fenwick presided over cases 3 and 8 on your list. He signed off on both plea agreements. Vivian's pen stopped moving. She looked at what she had just written on the legal pad in front of her. Fenwick's son-in-law employed by Rex Calhoun's department. Fenwick's name in Dale Calhoun's fundraiser donor records 4 years running. Fenwick's signature on 2 of the original plea agreements that this prosecution intended to challenge. And now Fenwick's sworn affidavit filed within 48 hours of formal charges being brought, claiming that she was too personally compromised to pursue justice. Harold Fenwick was not a disinterested retired jurist offering an honest professional assessment of a colleague's fitness for a case. Harold Fenwick was a man with his hands inside this thing up to the elbow, a man who had signed the paperwork that had sent 2 of these women toward plea deals they could not afford to fight a man whose son-in-law worked for the department being prosecuted, a man who had been putting money into the sheriff's fundraiser for 4 consecutive years. His affidavit was not a professional opinion. It was obstruction. Jerome, she said, I need every one of those findings sourced and documented before dawn. Financial Records Department roster. case dockets everything with a paper trail that can be verified and authenticated and placed on a bench in open court without being challenged on provenance. "Already pulling it," he said. Then Vivian. He said her name the way he only said it when he meant something specific by it. "We have got him." She believed him. But belief was not enough for what came next. Paper was enough. Documentation was enough. The kind of sourced and verified and exhibit-labeled evidence that can withstand anything thrown at it that cannot be moved by any amount of pressure from the other direction. "Get it done," she said. "I will be here." She ended the call and looked at the time on her phone. 3:14 in the morning. She thought about Dale Calhoun's voice on the phone, warm and unhurried, fairly early in a very promising career. She thought about Harold Fenwick signing plea agreements for 2 women on her list and then filing an affidavit to protect the man who had arrested them. She thought about all of it, the whole connected structure of it, and something settled in her chest that was not anger, something colder and more useful than anger. The feeling of a woman who has located the exact shape of what she is dealing with and knows precisely what tool to use on it. She picked up her phone again and called Judge Eleanor Grant. 2 rings. Eleanor picked up. No irritation at the hour. "Just tell me." Vivian told her everything. When she finished, Eleanor was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "File the counter motion by 8 o'clock, she said. "I will make sure the right eyes are on it by 9. Vivian pulled a fresh legal pad in front of her, and she began to write. At 5:48 in the morning, Vivian pulled into a gas station, the only establishment open at that hour in Caldwell County, a small fluorescent island sitting in the middle of all that pre-dawn darkness on the corner of Route 7 and Miller Street, humming to itself like something that did not know the hour and would not have cared if it did. She cut the engine and sat for a moment with her hands resting in her lap, looking at the lit storefront without seeing it, the way you look at something when your eyes need to be pointed at something, but your mind is somewhere else entirely. The sky outside was in the particular state of uncertainty that exists in the 20 minutes or so before sunrise actually commits to itself. Not dark anymore, but not light either, a gray that contained the memory of night without yet containing the fact of morning. She was running on 3 hours of sleep. The counter motion had been filed. Jerome had sent the last of the sourced documentation at 4:35 in the morning, with a single text message that said in its entirety, bulletproof. Judge Eleanor Grant had confirmed the hearing was set for that afternoon. Everything that could be done before 8 o'clock had been done, which left one thing. She went inside and bought 2 coffees from the machine behind the register. Real ones hot, the kind that had the decency to be what they claimed to be, and carried them back out to her car and set them carefully in the cup holders, and drove east through the gray pre-dawn toward the eastern edge of Caldwell County. She knocked on apartment 208 at 6:14 in the morning. She had half expected no answer, had prepared herself on the drive over for the possibility of waiting on the landing as long as it took, had decided she was willing to wait. But the door opened after less than a minute. Monique stood in the doorway in the same gray sweatshirt she had been wearing the first time Vivian stood here, her eyes carrying the specific swollen tiredness of someone who had cried herself to sleep not long ago and woken much earlier than she intended. She looked at Vivian, then at the 2 coffees in Vivian's hands, then back at Vivian. Something moved across her face that was not exactly gratitude and was not exactly surprise, something quieter than both of those. She stepped aside without a word and let Vivian in. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when the children in them are still asleep. A soft, inhabited silence that felt different from the silence of an empty place. The little girl in yellow socks was not yet visible. The kitchen table had a half-finished coloring book on one end and a stack of unopened mail on the other, the kind of mail that has stopped being opened because opening it only confirms things you already know. Vivian set one of the coffees in front of the chair across from her and sat down. Monique wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table between them for a moment before she spoke. "They put my record out there," she said. Her voice was flat and scraped clean. the voice of someone who has arrived at a level of exhaustion that is beyond the stage where things still have the power to shock you. I was 16 years old. It was a bottle of nail polish from a discount store. And now everybody who looks me up, every employer, every landlord, every person who does any kind of background on me ever, that is going to be the first thing they see. She shook her head slowly. How is that different from what Rex Calhoun did to me the first time? It was a fair question, precisely and honestly framed, and it deserved a fair and honest answer, which Vivian gave her. It is not different, she said. Not in kind. It is the same tactic exactly. Find something, weaponize it, use it to make you feel like you have no right to stand up. She paused. But here is what it also is. It is desperation. If they were not afraid of you, Monique, if a 19-year-old woman in a gray sweatshirt with a year-and-a-half-old daughter did not represent a genuine threat to them, they would not have gone looking for a shoplifting charge from when you were 16 years old and put it on the internet. They did that because you are the thing that scares them most right now, and the fact that they had to go back 3 years to a teenage shoplifting charge to find something to use against you tells you everything about how little they actually have. Monique was listening. She had stopped pretending not to be. Vivian set her coffee down and looked across the table. I'm going to tell you something I have never said to anyone I have worked with in more than 20 years of practice, she said, and Monique looked at her with the wary attention of someone who has heard a lot of things that turned out to be less true than they were delivered. When I was 22 and had just passed the bar and started at my first firm, I was the only black woman in the building above the administrative level, she said. Senior partners asked me to refill the coffee at client meetings, not because they thought I was the administrative staff, but because they wanted to establish something to put something in the air between us that we would all just accept without discussing it. I was sent to the wrong entrance on more than one occasion. I worked nights for 3 years to get through law school while people who were half as prepared as I was walked straight through doors that stayed closed for me every time I put my hand on them. She paused. I made state attorney before I turned 40. And last Tuesday morning, a deputy in this county pressed me against my own car in a courthouse parking lot and grabbed my briefcase off the car and laughed when I told him he was going to want to open it. She looked directly at Monique across the kitchen table. They will always make us prove we belong. That will not stop. That is one of the things that does not stop. The only question available to us, the only question we actually get to answer, is whether we make them prove they deserve to get away with it. The apartment was very still. From the back room came the small and entirely peaceful sounds of a child beginning to wake the sounds of someone moving from sleep into the morning with the complete unhurried confidence of a person who does not yet know there is anything to be afraid of. Monique looked toward the hallway. She stayed there for a long moment with her eyes on the doorway and her hands around her coffee cup. And something moved across her face that was quiet and certain and final. The expression of a decision arriving, rather than being made the way some decisions do not. As a moment of choice, but as an acknowledgement of something that was already true. She looked back at Vivian. Okay, she said. Let us do it. She filed the counter motion at 7:58 in the morning, 2 minutes before the deadline. Not because she had been cutting it close, but because she had had it ready since 5 o'clock and had spent the last 2 hours reading it one final time. The way a carpenter runs a hand along every joint of something they have built before it has to hold weight looking for anything soft, any place where the argument thinned or the sourcing went shallow or the chain of evidence lost a link. She found nothing. She hit submit and set the phone down. Jerome looked up from across the table. She nodded once. He exhaled. By 9 o'clock, exactly as Judge Eleanor Grant had promised, the recusal hearing was on the docket for Courtroom 4 that afternoon. The presiding judge assigned to the hearing was the Honorable Patricia Morse, a federal appointee from the Western District who had no prior cases in Caldwell County and no recorded connection to anyone in it, whose biography Vivian read twice on the drive over and found clean in the way that the most important things need to be clean. No loose threads, no entries that required explanation, No names in the professional history that pointed toward anything she would have needed to disclose. Courtroom 4 was small, and it was full by the time Vivian walked in and set her briefcase on the prosecution table and opened it and began arranging her 12 exhibit folders in order. The sheriff's legal team was already seated at the respondent's table. 2 attorneys in well-cut suits with the coordinated, well-rested quality of people who had billed significant hours preparing for this hearing and had come in expecting it to go their way. In the gallery behind them, Sheriff Dale Calhoun had settled his large frame into a wooden bench with the proprietorial ease of a man who considers himself the natural occupant of every room he enters. He watched Vivian cross the room with flat, steady eyes. She did not look at him. Rex himself was not present, only Dale and Vivian noticed, as she arranged her exhibits, that Dale's left thumb was hooked into his belt in exactly the way Rex's always was. The identical gesture learned the same way passed down through a family that had confused authority with ownership for so long that the 2 concepts had become indistinguishable to them. Judge Morse entered at 1 o'clock precisely. The room rose and sat. The lead attorney for the sheriff's side was a man named Ellison, and he was good, genuinely good, which Vivian respected in the same way you respect a well-constructed argument, even when the argument is aimed at you. He laid out his case cleanly and without histrionics. The Bar Association dinner, Fenwick's affidavit, the personal nature of Vivian's arrest, the appearance of bias that could compromise the integrity of the prosecution. He used the word compromised 4 times in 6 minutes, and conflict of interest twice, and near the end of his argument he arrived at the core of it, delivered with something that was almost sympathy. Ms. Brooks is a capable attorney, but she is relatively early in her tenure as state attorney, and this situation, being personally arrested by the very defendant she is now prosecuting, would test the objectivity of any prosecutor. For someone at her stage of experience, the appearance of personal grievance is simply too significant to overlook. Judge Morse looked at Vivian. Response. Vivian stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anything. She opened the first exhibit folder and placed it on the bench in front of the judge. This, she said, is a copy of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department personnel roster. Highlighted on page 3 is the name Marcus Briley, active lieutenant, 7 years of service. Marcus Briley is the son-in-law of retired Judge Harold Fenwick, whose sworn affidavit forms the entire evidentiary basis of this recusal motion. She placed the second exhibit beside it. These are the public financial disclosure records from Sheriff Dale Calhoun's annual fundraising events for the past 5 years. Judge Fenwick's name appears in the donor records for 4 consecutive years. This is not inference or allegation. It is documented public record. Third exhibit. These are the original case dockets for complainants 3 and 8 in case number 2024-CR-1189. The presiding judge on both original hearings, the judge who reviewed and signed off on both plea agreements that this prosecution now intends to challenge, was Harold Fenwick. She looked at Judge Morse steadily the way she had looked at hundreds of benches across 22 years, with the calm certainty of someone who knows what the documents say and trusts them to say it. The man whose affidavit claims that I am too personally compromised to pursue justice, she said, has his son-in-law employed by the defendant's department, his name in the defendant's fundraiser donor records for 4 consecutive years, and his signature on 2 of the plea agreements that this prosecution exists to challenge. That affidavit is not a professional assessment of my fitness for this case. It is an attempt to obstruct a prosecution that Harold Fenwick has a documented personal and financial interest in preventing. She paused. When Ellison rose to return to his argument about her experience and her relative newness to the role of state attorney, Vivian reached into her briefcase and removed her 22-year service record and placed it quietly on the bench without a word. Then she sat down. Judge Morse read in complete silence for 4 minutes, the kind of silence that a courtroom produces when everyone in it understands that something real is happening. Then she looked up. "The motion to recuse is denied in full," she said. Her voice was flat and entirely final. "Furthermore, I am referring Judge Fenwick's affidavit to the State Judicial Conduct Commission for formal review." From the gallery came the sound of a large man getting to his feet, the specific sound of a man who has operated for decades without encountering a wall he could not move through and has just run into one at full speed. Dale Calhoun was standing, his face gone, the dark mottled red of something that has been under pressure for a long time and has just reached its limit. His mouth open, his body occupying the space in the way of a man who still believed that occupying space was the same as holding ground. His attorney grabbed his arm and pulled him down hard. Dale's body dropped back to the bench as his attorney pulled him, and in that motion, the easy, settled authority he had carried into this room was suddenly visible for what it was. A performance, a posture built over 40 years of a county that had agreed to believe in it, and now the agreement was being revised and the posture had nothing left to hold it up. His left thumb, which had been hooked in his belt the entire hearing, the way Rex's thumb always hooked in his belt, released and his hand dropped flat to his thigh. The gesture simply gone. And in its absence, something was visible that all his years of authority had been arranged to conceal a man without his armor in a room that was no longer his. Judge Morse looked at the gallery, once the brief level look of a woman who has dealt with larger disruptions than this and found them equally unimpressive. This hearing is adjourned. The news vans had appeared the day after the filing. 2 white trucks with satellite dishes on their roofs parking in the courthouse lot with the casual authority of news crews everywhere, who understand that the right to park wherever the story is does not require a permit. A correspondent in a red blazer was setting up her stand-up shot with the courthouse entrance behind her, and a cameraman was framing the columns and the flagpole with the flag that still needed replacing. And Vivian had watched all of this from the conference room window for about 30 seconds before turning back to her documents. Her communications director, a careful man named Genesis who had the particular gift of delivering bad news in a way that was honest without being alarming, called that afternoon to tell her it had gone regional 3 local affiliates and 1 cable pickup, and that Tanya Reid's footage was circulating on every platform. He also mentioned in the slightly cushioned way he had of mentioning things he knew she was not going to enjoy that there was a segment. Jerome pulled it up on his laptop and turned the screen toward her. A man behind a desk with a chyron that read Common Sense Commentary. Red-faced in the particular way of a man whose certainty has made him permanently flushed, leaning toward the camera with the air of someone sharing something obvious that everyone else has been too cowardly to say. "Here is what nobody wants to say," the man was saying. This woman parked in a reserved space and did not immediately identify herself to a law enforcement officer. That is the whole story. Deputy Calhoun was doing his job. He held up a finger. "I have looked into this Brooks woman. 44 years old, relatively new to this role. What I am seeing is someone who let a routine interaction become personal and now wants to use the power of her office to go after a 13-year veteran because her feelings got hurt. Is this really what we want from our prosecutors? Someone this green, this reactive?" Jerome closed the laptop. The room was quiet for a moment. "Green," Vivian said. "Yeah." She nodded once. Then she went back to her documents. Genesis called back an hour later, his voice carrying the carefully distributed weight of someone walking a path they are not certain will hold. "Vivian," he said, "I really think we need a statement. Something measured. Make it about the broader issue, not about you personally. Do not give them the personal angle. Do not let them frame this as a grudge." "I hear you, Genesis. I know you do." He paused. "I just do not make it personal. That is all I am asking. Keep it clean." She thanked him and ended the call. "Do not make it personal." She had been hearing that sentence since she was 22 years old, said with kindness always by people who meant well, genuinely meant well. People who cared about her and understood that composure was a form of protection and who wanted to extend that protection as far as it would reach. But the sentence had followed her through every dismissal and every slight and every room she had walked into and been looked at like she had arrived at the wrong address, and every time it had meant the same thing underneath its kindness, which was the professional cost of naming this thing as too high for you to afford. She closed the file in front of her and called her mother. Dorothy Brooks picked up on the third ring. 70 years old, and her voice had the quality it had always had, unhurried and grounded, like something that had decided a long time ago what it was and had not revisited the question since. "I saw the news," Dorothy said, before Vivian could begin. "Genesis wants me to put out a statement," Vivian said. "Keep it impersonal." A quiet beat. "They have been telling you that since you were 22, her mother said. "Every single time. Every single time something happened to you. Do not make it personal, Vivian. Keep your head down. Stay professional." Another pause. "You want to know something? Tell me." "It was always personal," Dorothy said. "Every single time. They just never let you say so." Vivian sat with that for a moment, and she let it settle all the way down to wherever things settle when they are true. "Okay, Mama," she said. "Go do your work." She hung up. She sat completely still for 10 seconds. Then she pulled the nearest file back in front of her, picked up her pen, and got back to work with a focus that was sharper and quieter and more dangerous than anything she had felt all day. Monday morning, and courtroom 2 was larger than courtroom 4, and it was full before the session began, every seat in the gallery occupied by 8:30 in the morning, with reporters and community members and 3 representatives from national civil rights organizations who had flown in the previous week and stayed people who had read the 51-page filing and understood what it was saying and decided that Caldwell County in November was where they needed to be. Barbara Price sat in the second row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, the posture of someone who has shown up to a great many things over the years and understands the discipline of being present without performing presence. 3 seats to her left sat Tanya Reed, 23 years old, courthouse records clerk. The woman who had raised her phone in a cold parking lot 7 weeks ago because she recognized what she was looking at and decided that documentation was what the moment required. Tanya sat straight and quiet and watched everything. Rex Calhoun was at the defense table in a dark suit that had the look of something purchased specifically for this occasion, his attorney beside him, a man from a firm in the capital who billed at a rate that suggested Rex had been quietly putting money aside for some time or had found someone to help him with that. Rex's jaw was set. His posture was rigid. He wore the performance of a man who has nothing to worry about, like a suit that is slightly the wrong size, convincing at a distance, and uncomfortable up close. And his left thumb, Vivian noticed as she settled into the prosecution table with Jerome beside her, and her 12 exhibit folders arranged in order, was hooked into his belt in the familiar way. Finding the groove it had been finding for 13 years, the automatic gesture of a man reasserting his claim to the space he was in. His attorney, who had clearly been briefed, placed a quiet hand on Rex's forearm. Rex stopped, looked at his own hand briefly, moved it to the table. The gesture had cost him something visible. Judge Patricia Morse entered at 9 o'clock precisely. The room rose and sat, and then it began. Vivian called her witnesses in the order she had spent 3 weeks determining, building the way she always built, slowly and deliberately, each piece of testimony adding another layer to what was already there. The first 3 witnesses were women from the complaint list, whose documentation was the most complete, whose timelines were the clearest, whose experiences mapped most precisely onto the pattern she had first mapped in the margins of a legal pad in a small conference room that smelled like old carpet. Each woman took the stand and told her story in plain language, without elaboration and without performance, the way people tell stories that are true. Different names, different dates, different parking lots, and different pretexts. But the shape of each story was identical. Rex's approach, his specific language, suspicious behavior, failure to comply, obstruction delivered in the same order every single time, as though from a script he had been running so long, it had become muscle memory. The escalation that followed, The arrest. The meeting with an overworked public defender who had 15 minutes and a plea deal and a caseload that did not permit the luxury of a trial. Rex's attorney cross-examined each witness with the same strategy, raising small inconsistencies in recalled dates or minor variations in how dialogue was remembered, and suggesting gently but repeatedly that each woman might bear some responsibility for how the situation had escalated by not complying immediately. It was competent work. It landed on nothing because the pattern was not located in any individual woman's behavior, but in the identical language that appeared in Rex Calhoun's own reports across 36 months, and those reports could not be cross-examined. By the end of the first day, the jury had heard from 5 complainants. Rex's left thumb hooked into his belt and released and hooked again, a motion his body was making without his awareness, the way bodies return to their habitual gestures under stress, and he could not seem to stop it. On the second morning, Vivian asked the bailiff to dim the lights and play a video for the jury. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, and the parking lot appeared. Cold asphalt, gray November sky. Vivian walking toward the courthouse entrance with her briefcase, Rex Calhoun crossing the lot behind her with his thumbs hooked in his belt. The sharp, flat, single syllable of "hey" cutting across the ambient sound. The escalation. The briefcase being snatched away in one motion, the handcuffs clicking shut. And then Rex's voice captured clearly by Tanya Reed's phone microphone, in the cold, still air filling the courtroom now with the same easy confidence it had carried in that parking lot 7 weeks ago. "Lady," he said on the recording, "I do not need to open anything." And then the door closing, and the cruiser driving away, and the parking lot returning to its ordinary Tuesday morning, just leaves on the asphalt and the flag on the pole, and the cold, quiet November air unchanged, as though what had just happened in it were simply another transaction in a county that had been conducting these transactions for 3 years. The jury watched in silence. When the footage ended, several of them did not immediately look away from the screen. They sat with it for a moment. The words hung in the air of the courtroom the way words sometimes do when a room decides they are important enough to hold on to. "Lady, I do not need to open anything." Rex's left thumb was no longer moving. His hand was flat on the defense table. His eyes were on the table surface and not the screen, and the muscle along the side of his jaw was visible from across the room. Over the second and third days of the trial, Vivian called 7 more witnesses, and each one added a dimension to the picture that was emerging in the courtroom the way pictures emerge when you step back far enough to see the whole thing, rather than its individual components. A woman named Denise Cartwright, 31 years old, who had been working toward a nursing certification when Rex's arrest put a misdemeanor conviction on her record, and the nursing school's admissions office sent her a rejection letter citing character concerns. She brought the letter to the stand and read from it in a voice that was steady in the way of something that has been braced against a wind for a long time. And when she finished reading, she folded it precisely along its original creases and held it in her lap with both hands. A woman named Patricia Okafor, who had been in the middle of a custody hearing when the arrest appeared in the background materials her ex-husband's attorney had submitted to the family court. Her attorney had objected. The objection had been partially sustained, but the record had been seen by the judge, and Patricia had spent the next 14 months demonstrating in supervised visits that she was a fit mother, which she had always been and would always have been if Rex Calhoun had not walked across a parking lot with his thumbs in his belt on a Tuesday morning and decided something. A woman who had returned to the courthouse the morning after her arrest to file a formal complaint. The desk officer on duty, a colleague of Rex's who had been on the force for 8 years, had told her in the particular tone that is not quite a threat, but is designed to function like one that she should probably just let it go. That some things were better left alone. That making noise about this kind of thing tended not to go the way people hoped. She had let it go. For 2 years she had let it go. She was not letting it go now. The jury was watching each of these women with the focused attention of people who are assembling something in their minds and can feel the shape of it becoming clear. Not with pity, not with the slightly distancing emotion of sympathy that keeps the thing at arm's length, but with something closer to recognition. The particular recognition of people who have had enough experience of the world to understand the shape they are looking at, even if they have never had a specific name for it. Across 3 days, 9 of the 12 complainants testified. And the pattern that Vivian had first seen written in the margins of her legal pad on a cold November afternoon in a small conference room that smelled like old carpet was now written in testimony in human voices, speaking in plain language about what had happened to them, and the plainness of it was its own kind of power, the thing that no amount of legal argument could get around because it was just people saying what was true. Rex at the defense table across those 3 days. His attorney's cross-examinations were growing shorter as the trial went on, the way a fire grows smaller when the fuel it has available is insufficient to sustain the original size. Rex's left thumb continued its restless motion, hooking into his belt and releasing the gesture occurring with greater frequency as the days passed, and the recognition of what was happening settled over him with the slow inevitability of weather. In the gallery, Dale Calhoun was present every single day in the same seat, his large frame filling the bench with the same proprietary ease watching. But the easy, settled authority that had characterized him in courtroom 4 on the day of the recusal hearing was different now, not gone, but different. The way a landscape looks different after rain. Recognizably the same, but with something altered in the quality of the light. And what was visible in Dale Calhoun's face, across those 3 days in the gallery, was the expression of a man watching something he built over 40 years being examined for the first time by people who had not agreed in advance to look away from what they found. On the evening of the 3rd day, Vivian was back in the conference room under the single desk lamp with Jerome across from her and the documents spread between them, and Jerome looked up from his notes and said, "Tomorrow is the one that matters." Vivian looked at the window at Caldwell County, dark and quiet outside. "I know," she said. The courtroom went very still when the name was called. Monique Adams walked from the gallery to the witness stand in a dark blue blouse and pressed slacks that Vivian was fairly certain she had borrowed from someone. Her posture careful and upright, and when she sat down she placed her hands flat on the rail in front of her and looked at Vivian and nodded once. A single complete nod. She was composed. That was the thing about it. The thing that Tanya Reid, watching from the gallery, would describe afterward to people who asked her what it had been like to be in that room. After everything, the leaked juvenile record, the blog post calling her a career criminal at 19, the weeks of fear, and the 6 in the morning conversation at a kitchen table with a woman who had brought 2 coffees and said things that were true. Monique Adams sat in that witness chair with her hands flat on the rail in front of her, and she was simply present in the way that takes more strength than most people understand. Vivian walked her through it carefully at the pace that serious testimony requires, giving each element the space it needed. The morning of the arrest, a Tuesday in February, a parking lot outside the county social services office, where Monique had gone to inquire about child care assistance for her daughter, who was 8 months old at the time and in the care of Monique's mother on the mornings Monique worked. Rex's approach, the way he had walked across the parking lot toward her, the language he had used, the escalation that had followed when she had tried to explain herself, and he had not wanted an explanation. The handcuffs, the drive to the processing annex, the charge. The public defender, who had met her in a courthouse hallway for 10 minutes and explained with the apologetic efficiency of someone who had 40 other cases and not enough hours that her chances at trial were not good, and the plea deal would resolve the matter and allow her to move forward. Move forward. As though a misdemeanor conviction were a speed bump rather than a wall. The housing voucher she had been waiting 16 months to receive, which was rescinded because of the conviction. The job she had lost. The conversation with her mother at the kitchen table trying to find language to explain to the woman who had raised her why she now had a criminal record when she had done nothing wrong. her daughter asleep in the next room, 8 months old and entirely unaware that the world she was being born into had just arranged itself a little less favorably around her mother. Monique's voice stayed even through all of it. It was the evenness not of someone who is not feeling the weight of what they are saying, but of someone who has decided that they are going to say it anyway regardless of weight. And then there was a moment, a significant moment, the moment that would be remembered by everyone present. During Monique's testimony, while Vivian was walking her through the details of the plea deal and its consequences, Rex Calhoun's left thumb, which had been hooking into his belt and releasing and hooking again for 3 full days, stopped. The motion simply ceased. His thumb dropped. His hands went flat on the defense table surface, both of them, and the gesture that had been with him in every scene from the parking lot to this courtroom. The unconscious territorial claim to every space he occupied was simply gone. And in its absence, for anyone watching closely, something was visible that the gesture had been there to conceal a man sitting without his armor in a room where the armor no longer worked. Vivian asked Monique one final question. "In the time since your conviction," she said, "has there been a single day where that record has not affected your life in some concrete way?" Monique looked at Rex Calhoun. She found his face across the courtroom, across the exhibit folders and the gallery and the distance between the witness stand and the defense table, and she held it steady and unflinching and without anger for a long and complete moment, the way you look at something when you want to make absolutely certain that it understands what is being said to it. "No," she said, "not one." Rex did not look up. He sat with his eyes on the table surface and did not move while Monique's gaze rested on him, and in his stillness the parking lot came back to him, not as memory, but as verdict. The sound of the briefcase being set down on the car, the sound of his own hand closing around the handle, the sound of his own laugh when she had warned him, "Lady, I do not need to open anything," those words returning now, not as something he had said in a parking lot, but as the summary of everything he had spent 13 years being, and the muscle along the side of his jaw tightened until it was visible from the gallery and his hands pressed flat against the table until the knuckles went pale, and the courtroom was very quiet, and the quiet was not neutral. It had weight and direction, and it was pointed at him with the precision of something that has been aimed carefully and for a long time. Tanya Reed in the gallery had her hands folded in her lap. She was not recording. She was simply watching. And on her face was the expression of someone who did something small and necessary 7 weeks ago in a cold parking lot, something that cost her nothing except the decision to do it, and is now watching what that decision set into motion arrive at where it was always going. Vivian turned to the bench. The prosecution rests. The jury was out for 3 hours and 40 minutes. During that time, Vivian sat in a small room off the main corridor of the courthouse with Jerome beside her, and neither of them talked much. Jerome reviewed notes. He did not need to review the professional version of having something to do with your hands. Vivian held her pen without writing, and the briefcase sat on the empty chair beside her, the worn leather catching the light from the single window, the dulled brass clasp holding everything closed. Jerome looked at the briefcase at one point, just briefly, and then looked at Vivian, and he did not say anything, but his expression said something. The expression of someone who has been in a room with another person through something difficult and has arrived at the kind of understanding that does not need words, because the words would be insufficient anyway. When the door opened and the notification came, they walked back to the courtroom together in silence. The jury filed in, and the foreperson, a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a silver chain around her neck, stood and looked at the bench. She held the verdict form in both hands, and she read it without dramatic pause, in the clear and direct voice of someone who has something real to say and intends to say it clearly. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom did not erupt. That was the thing about it, the thing that stayed with everyone who was present. Instead of eruption, there was a collective exhale, the sound of people releasing something they had been holding. The particular sound that is not quite silence and not quite sound, but is the thing in between the breath that comes when something that has been suspended for a long time is finally allowed to resolve. Rex Calhoun sat at the defense table without moving. His attorney placed a hand on his arm in the automatic gesture of someone who has done this before and understands what this moment requires of them. Rex did not react. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and he looked for the first time in Vivian's observation of him across 7 weeks of this like someone who has run out of road. All the road he had been given by 13 years, and an uncle's name and a badge and a county that had arranged itself around his certainty, all of it gone, and what was left was just a man sitting in a chair with nothing between him and what was true. Vivian sat at the prosecution table, and she felt something that she had not let herself feel across the entire 7 weeks of this work, not in the parking lot, and not in the conference room, and not in Monique Adams's kitchen, and not in the recusal hearing, and not across any of the long, dark mornings when she had been working alone under a single lamp. The thing she felt now was not triumph, which is a loud emotion, and tends to belong to the moment rather than the weight that produced it. What she felt was quieter than triumph, something like the sound a door makes when it closes softly on a room that has been standing open for too long. Something settling back into its proper position. Something resolved. She looked at the briefcase on the chair beside her. She thought about her mother pressing it into her hands outside a testing center on a warm summer morning more than 2 decades ago with the expression of a woman who had spent 22 years working toward that moment and was now pressing the product of that work into her daughter's hands for safekeeping. Now you carry something in this they cannot take from you. Rex Calhoun had taken it. He had grabbed it off a car in a cold parking lot because he had looked at a woman and decided in 4 seconds what she was worth and what she was not, and the grab had felt to him like the end of a sentence. It was not the end of the sentence. It was the beginning of one. Across the courtroom, Rex's eyes moved briefly and met hers. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, the steady and complete gaze of someone who has been paying attention the entire time, and then she looked away. Not because she had to, not because the looking was difficult, but because he had ceased to be the most important thing in the room, and the briefcase on the chair beside her was. 2 weeks later, courtroom 2. The same gallery, the same rows of faces, some of them the same people who had been present for the verdict back to see it finished. The way you go back to see something through to its conclusion, because you were there at the beginning and the ending belongs to you in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to disregard. Barbara Price in the second row. Tanya Reed 3 seats to her left. Rex Calhoun stood before the bench in the same dark suit. He was the same physical man he had been on the day he crossed a parking lot with his thumbs hooked in his belt toward a woman he had decided in 4 seconds was not worth more than 1 syllable. The same broad shoulders, the same jutting jaw, the same size. But something essential had gone out of him. The easy, settled certainty, the quality of someone who has never once woken up in the morning wondering whether today might be the day that consequences arrived, that quality was simply gone. Now evacuated, and what remained in its absence was just a man in a suit standing before a federal bench with nowhere left to go. His hands hung at his sides. Thumbs not hooked into anything, not in his belt, not in a pocket, not anywhere, just hanging. The gesture that had defined every scene he had occupied from the parking lot to this moment, the unconscious territorial claim, was absent. Completely, finally absent. And in that absence, visible to anyone who had been paying attention, was the full measure of what Rex Calhoun had lost. Judge Patricia Morse looked down at him from the bench with the same flat, businesslike expression she had maintained through every hour of these proceedings, the expression of a woman who considers her job to be the application of law, and considers the application of law to be serious, and has organized her professional demeanor accordingly. She did not make a speech. She read the sentence in a clear and level voice. 8 years in federal prison. She paused, followed by 5 years of supervised probation upon release. She paused again. Permanent revocation of your law enforcement certification, effective immediately, And then, after a breath with the particular deliberateness of someone who knows that this sentence is the one that matters most of all, "You will never carry a badge again." That last sentence read after a pause with the weight that came from standing alone in the air of the courtroom after everything that had preceded it. The years were time and time was serious, but the revocation was something else. Rex Calhoun had built his entire understanding of himself on what the badge permitted him to do, on the authority it extended on the space it allowed him to claim. The badge was gone now, permanently publicly entered into the record as a fact that could not be revised. Rex's attorney placed a hand on his arm. Rex did not react. He stood and absorbed it the way a man absorbs something he has finally completely run out of road to avoid, which is to say he absorbed it without any remaining option to do otherwise. And then he was led toward the side door of the courtroom, and before the door closed behind him their eyes met one final time across the room. Vivian did not smile. She did not nod. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. The same steady, level, complete gaze she had held for 7 weeks, the gaze of someone who has been paying close attention the entire time and has not been surprised by anything she found. Then she looked away, not because she was finished, but because he was. The door closed. The sound it made was ordinary, a latch catching a frame settling into place. But in the quiet of the courtroom, it had the quality of something final. It sounded like the closing of a chapter that had been open for 3 years too long. The Federal Detention Center processed Rex Calhoun the way it processed everyone, which is to say without ceremony or accommodation, efficiently moving him from one category to another with the administrative efficiency of an institution that has performed this particular transformation many thousands of times and has long since stopped finding it remarkable. They took his suit. They gave him clothes that were not his, a uniform that belonged to the institution rather than to any individual occupying it, and he put them on in a room that smelled like disinfectant and the particular staleness of a space where the air is recycled without ever being renewed, and the absence of his own uniform, the one he had worn for 13 years, was physical in a way he had not anticipated. Not symbolic, but actual, like something had been removed from his body rather than simply from his closet. He was assigned to a bunk in a cell block that held 40 men. He lay on it in the first afternoon with the ceiling above him, a plain concrete ceiling with no feature or variation and nothing else. No cruiser, no radio crackling with dispatch calls that confirmed his authority over the day. No clipboard, no paperwork of any kind that assigned him a role in the processing of other people. Just the ceiling and the sounds of the block, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same. He thought about the parking lot, not with anything as organized as regret, but with the more specific and less comfortable sensation of a man who has located the precise moment at which everything went wrong and cannot stop returning to it. A cold morning, a dark sedan pulling into a reserved space, a woman stepping out with a worn leather briefcase. 4 seconds. The decision of 4 seconds made with the absolute confidence of 13 years of being right, and which had been wrong in a way that was now permanent and recorded and complete. He had laughed. "Lady, I do not need to open anything." That laugh returning to him now in the silence of the cell block at the end of his first day sounded like the sound of a man who had been certain of something that was not true. He heard footsteps stop outside his cell. He looked up. A man was leaning against the bars, arms folded, watching him with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has plenty of time and has decided to spend a portion of it on this. He was large. He had the careful stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is more dangerous than noise. "I know who you are," the man said. His voice was quiet, which made it carry further than a loud voice would have. "We all do. News travels fast in here." His eyes moved over Rex the way Rex's eyes had moved over people in parking lots for 13 years, assessing, deciding, arriving at a conclusion before the other person had a chance to say anything. The difference was that Rex Calhoun, for the first time in his life, was the one being assessed. A correction officer's boot scraped against concrete somewhere down the tier. The man at the bars pushed himself upright without another word and moved away, his footsteps receding into the noise of the block. Rex lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and understood in a way he had not understood anything in a very long time, exactly where he was and exactly what had brought him here, and he had 8 years to sit with both of those things. Outside Caldwell County continued without him moving through November toward December. Indifferent to his absence the way all places are ultimately indifferent to the people who believed they were essential to them. Sheriff Dale Calhoun resigned the following Friday at 5 o'clock, the last hour of the working week, in a press release 3 sentences long that cited a desire to spend more time with his family, which was the political equivalent of leaving through a back door while the fire is still being discussed. The assumption being that if you leave quietly enough, the leaving itself might not become the story. Everyone was watching. The Department of Justice confirmed within the week that a federal grand jury had been seated to examine the broader conduct of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, and Dale Calhoun's name appeared in the first paragraph of their public statement. Judge Harold Fenwick received his formal censure from the State Judicial Conduct Commission on a Tuesday morning. The document was entered into the public record and copied to every judicial appointment board in the state. His affidavit was formally designated as evidence of attempted obstruction of justice and entered into the federal case file. A man who had spent 30 years on the bench had reduced his legacy to a footnote in someone else's corruption, and the footnote was now permanent and public and could not be revised. Monique Adams's conviction was vacated on a Wednesday afternoon. Jerome forwarded Vivian the confirmation without comment. She read it once, set her phone down, and sat quietly for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that comes when something real has happened, and you need a moment to let it be real before you move on to the next thing. A 19-year-old woman who had done nothing wrong now had nothing on her record. The housing voucher, the job, the years of walking through the world under the weight of something she had never earned officially undone. It could not give Monique back the time or the sleep or the conversation with her mother at the kitchen table. But it was real. It was documented. It was permanent in the way that matters. All 11 remaining complainants had their records cleared before the end of the calendar year. Councilwoman Barbara Price organized a public ceremony at the Caldwell County Community Center and stood at the podium and read all 12 names aloud slowly, one at a time. The way names deserve to be read when someone has finally decided that they matter, and Tanya Reed stood in the front row of that ceremony with her lanyard around her neck and did not try to compose herself, because she understood that composure was not what this moment required. That evening after the ceremony, Vivian drove alone back to the courthouse parking lot and cut the engine. She parked in the same reserved space, the one marked Court Officers Only. Near the side entrance, the same space where everything had begun on a cold Tuesday morning 7 weeks ago. She sat for a moment with the engine off and her hands in her lap and looked at the courthouse through the windshield. The squat brick building with its chipped columns and its flagpole and its flag that still needed replacing. The building that looked older than it had any right to, that had convinced itself long ago that nothing here ever needed to change. The building looked the same from the outside. It would look the same from the outside for a while yet, but something inside it had shifted. Not everything, not enough, not nearly as much as 12 names deserved, but something real and concrete and unable to be undone. A record that now existed, a pattern that had been named and documented and litigated and decided 12 women whose stories were now part of the permanent file rather than the pile of things set aside. She reached to the passenger seat and picked up the briefcase. Held it for a moment, the worn leather soft under her hands, the brass clasp cool in the November air. She opened it, not looking for anything specific, just opened it the way you open something that has been with you through something significant, to confirm that it is still what it was. Inside the credential wallet, the governor's appointment letter, the DOJ observer's credential, the legal pad dense with 7 weeks of notes, and at the very bottom, where she had always kept it, a photograph. Her mother, 25 years younger than she was now, standing outside a testing center on a summer morning with a briefcase held out in both hands, and an expression on her face that contained everything it had cost both of them to arrive at that moment. The woman receiving the briefcase in the photograph was 22 years old and had just passed the bar exam and had not yet learned how many rooms would make her prove she belonged. Now you carry something in this they cannot take from you. Vivian looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she placed it back carefully in its place at the bottom of everything, and she closed the clasp. She thought about Monique Adams sitting at a kitchen table in a gray sweatshirt, picking up a pen with the deliberateness of someone who is making a decision and signing their name to it at the same moment. She thought about the little girl in yellow socks in the kitchen doorway. She thought about how much courage it had taken for a 19-year-old woman with a toddler daughter and a record she had not earned to pick up that pen and mean it. Her phone rang. Jerome on the second ring. 12 names cleared, he said. All confirmed. I know, she said. I heard. A pause between them, the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between two people who have been in the same room through something difficult and do not need to perform relief at each other, because the relief is just present, the way temperature is present, not announced, but real. Jerome said, What do you want to do next? What do? Vivian looked through the windshield at the courthouse, at the parking lot, at the space she was sitting in that she had every right to park in on a cold Tuesday morning 7 weeks ago. She looked at the flagpole. She looked at the flag that still needed replacing, and in the last of the November light it moved slightly in the wind, and for a moment, just a moment, it looked less like something worn out and more like something that was still here, still present, still doing the thing it was put up to do. There are 19 other counties in this circuit, she said. She started the engine. She put the briefcase on the passenger seat in the same seat where Rex Calhoun had once tossed it without a second glance, and she pulled out of the parking lot away from Caldwell County into whatever came next. The courthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror. The road was dark, and the headlights lit the yellow center line, and the night came in on both sides, and Vivian Brooks drove. If this story moved you, if you found yourself somewhere inside it in Vivian's patience, in Monique's courage, in Tanya's quiet decision to raise her phone in a cold parking lot, because she knew what she was watching mattered and refused to look away, please take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Every like and every subscription tells us that these stories are worth telling, that justice and accountability, and the people who fight for both, deserve to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, someone who needs to be reminded that the only question worth answering is whether we make them prove they deserve to get away with it. We read every comment, and we will see you in the next story.